Chapter 19 of The Lodger. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 19. It seemed to Mrs. Bunting that she had been sitting there a long time. It was really about a quarter of an hour, when her official friend came back. "Better come along now," he whispered. "It'll begin soon." She followed him out into a passage, up a row of steep stone steps, and so into the coroner's court. The court was big, well-lighted room, in some ways not unlike a chapel, the more so that a kind of gallery ran halfway round, a gallery evidently set aside for the general public, for it was now crammed to its utmost capacity. Mrs. Bunting glanced timidly towards the serried row of faces. Had it not been for her good fortune in meeting the man she was now following, it was there that she would have had to try and make her way. And she would have failed. Those people had rushed in the moment the doors were opened, pushing, fighting their way in a way she could never have pushed or fought. There were just a few women among them, set, determined-looking women, belonging to every class, but made one by their love of sensation and their power of forcing their way in where they wanted to be. But the women were few. The great majority of those standing there were men who were also representative of every class of Londoner. The centre of the court was like an arena. It was sunk 2 or 3 steps below the surrounding gallery. Just now it was comparatively clear of people, save for the benches on which sat the men who were to compose the jury. Some way from these men, huddled together in a kind of big pew, stood 7 people, 3 women and 4 men. "Do you see the witnesses?" whispered the inspector, pointing these out to her. He supposed her to know one of them with familiar knowledge, but, if that were so, she made no sign. Between the windows, facing the whole room, was a kind of little platform, on which stood a desk and an armchair. Mrs. Bunting guessed rightly that it was there the coroner would sit. And to the left of the platform was the witness stand, also raised considerably above the jury. Amazingly different, and far, far more grim and awe-inspiring than the scene of the inquest which had taken place so long ago, on that bright April day, in the village inn. There the coroner had sat on the same level as the jury, and the witnesses had simply stepped forward one by one and taken their place before him. Looking round her fearfully, Mrs. Bunting thought she would surely die if ever she were exposed to the ordeal of standing in that curious box-like stand, and she stared across at the bench where sat the 7 witnesses with a feeling of sincere pity in her heart. But even she soon realized that her pity was wasted. Each woman witness looked eager, excited, and animated, well pleased to be the centre of attention and attraction to the general public. It was plain each was enjoying her part of important, if humble, actress in the thrilling drama which was now absorbing the attention of all London. It might almost be said of the whole world. Looking at these women, Mrs. Bunting wondered vaguely which was which. Was it that rather draggle-tailed-looking young person who had certainly, or almost certainly, seen the avenger within 10 seconds of the double crime being committed? The woman who, aroused by one of his victims' cry of terror, had rushed to her window and seen the murderer's shadowy form pass swiftly by in the fog? Yet another woman, so Mrs. Bunting now remembered, had given a most circumstantial account of what the avenger looked like, for he, it was supposed, had actually brushed by her as he passed. Those 2 women now before her had been interrogated and cross-examined again and again, not only by the police, but by representatives of every newspaper in London. It was from what they had both said, unluckily their accounts materially differed, that official description of the avenger had been worked up, that which described him as being a good-looking, respectable young fellow of 28, carrying a newspaper parcel. As for the 3rd woman, she was doubtless an acquaintance, a boon companion of the dead. Mrs. Bunting looked away from the witnesses and focused her gaze on another unfamiliar sight. Specially prominent, running indeed through the whole length of the shut-in space, that is, from the coroner's high dais right across to the opening in the wooden barrier, was an ink-splashed table, at which, when she had first taken her place, there had been sitting 3 men busily sketching. But now every seat at the table was occupied by tired, intelligent-looking men, each with a notebook, or with some loose sheets of paper, before him. "Them's the reporters," whispered her friend. "They don't like coming till the last minute, for they has to be the last to go. At an ordinary inquest there are only 2, maybe 3, attending, but now every paper in the kingdom is pretty well applied for a pass to that reporter's table." He looked consideringly down into the well of the court. "Now let me see what I can do for you." Then he beckoned to the coroner's officer. "Perhaps you could put this lady just over there, in a corner by herself? Related to a relation of the deceased, but doesn't want to be—" He whispered a word or two, and the other nodded sympathetically and looked at Mrs. Bunting with interest. "I'll put her just here," he muttered. "There's no one coming there to-day. You see, there are only 7 witnesses. Sometimes we have a lot more than that." And he kindly put her on a now empty bench opposite to where the 7 witnesses stood and sat with their eager, set faces, ready, aye, more than ready, to play their part. For a moment every eye in the court was focused on Mrs. Bunting, but soon those who had stared so hungrily, so intently at her, realized that she had nothing to do with the case. She was evidently there as a spectator, and, more fortunate than most, she had a "friend at court," and so was able to sit comfortably, instead of having to stand in the crowd. But she was not long left in isolation. Very soon some of the important-looking gentlemen she had seen downstairs came into the court, and were ushered over to her seat while 2 or 3 among them, including the famous writer whose face was so familiar that it almost seemed to Mrs. Bunting like that of a kindly acquaintance, were accommodated at the reporter's table. "Gentlemen, the coroner." The jury stood up, shuffling their feet, and then sat down again. Over the spectators there fell a sudden silence. And then what immediately followed recalled to Mrs. Bunting, for the first time, that informal little country inquest of long ago. First came the "Oyez! Oyez!" the old Norman French summons to all whose business it is to attend a solemn inquiry into the death, sudden, unexplained, terrible, of a fellow being. The jury, there were 14 of them, all stood up again. They raised their hands and solemnly chanted together the curious words of their oath. Then came a quick, informal exchange of sentences twixt the coroner and his officer. Yes, everything was in order. The jury had viewed the bodies—he quickly corrected himself, the body, for technically speaking the inquest just about to be held only concerned one body. And then, amid a silence so absolute that the slightest rustle could be heard through the court, the coroner, a clever-looking gentleman, though not so old as Mrs. Bunting thought he ought to have been to occupy so important a position on so important a day, gave a little history, as it were, of the terrible and mysterious Avenger crimes. He spoke very clearly, warming to his work as he went on. He told them that he had been present at the inquest held on one of the Avenger's former victims. "I only went through professional curiosity," he threw in by way of parenthesis, "little thinking, gentlemen, that the inquest on one of these unhappy creatures would ever be held in my court." On and on he went, though he had in truth but little to say, and though that little was known to every one of his listeners. Mrs. Bunting heard one of the older gentlemen sitting near her whisper to another, "Drawing it out all he can, that's what he's doing, having the time of his life, evidently." And then the other whispered back, so low that she could only just catch the words, "Aye, aye, but he's a good chap. I knew his father. We were at school together. Takes his job very seriously, you know. He does to-day, at any rate." She was listening intently, waiting for a word, a sentence, which would relieve her hidden terrors, or, on the other hand, confirm them. But the word, the sentence, was never uttered. And yet, at the very end of his long peroration, the coroner did throw out a hint which might mean anything, or nothing. "I am glad to say that we hope to obtain such evidence to-day as will in time lead to the apprehension of the miscreant who has committed, and is still committing, these terrible crimes." Mrs. Bunting stared uneasily up into the coroner's firm, determined-looking face. What did he mean by that? Was there any new evidence? Evidence of which Joe Chandler, for instance, was ignorant? And, as if in answer to the unspoken question, her heart gave a sudden leap, for a big, burly man